Hey everybody, thanks for coming to the it's April, right? April Dash event. Yeah, we're not sure if it's April anymore because of what's outside, but thanks again for coming. I'm Justin Schell, Digital Humanities Specialist for the libraries, also involved in DASH, Digital Arts, Sciences, and Humanities, which is a group of folks and kind of an initiative from the libraries of exploring different interdisciplinary collaborations on digital tools and methodologies. So things like data mining, text mining, mapping, crowdsourcing, visualization, sonification, things like that. And you're going to see the art side of DASH today and looking at different forms of data arts, aesthetic engagements, and different aesthetic engagements with data, big, medium, and small. So we have three presenters, three groups of, well, one group of presenters and two individual presenters. Behind me is Mike Duffy, Scott St. George, and Daniel Crawford. Scott is assistant professor. I didn't get those two confused. Assistant professor in geography, right? And Daniel Crawford is an undergrad in geography, and Mike Duffy works with the music department. Stephen Hammer is from North Dakota State University. He is a PhD student in English and also a visual artist, and he will be taking a job at St. Joseph University in Philadelphia in the fall. Woo! And finally, Jan Estep, who is a professor of art, is going to talk about some of her projects with fMRI data. So I'm going to get out of the way and let these guys take over. Thanks.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name's Scott. I'm a professor in the Department of Geography. I know there are at least a few undergrads in the room. So my first question is, has anybody ever taken a class called Geography 1403 or Biogeography of the Global Garden? All right, no one's taken it. That's really unusual because it's one of the largest classes in the U. This semester it has over 500 students in the room. And that setting is a challenging place to try and get something across related to environment and environmental sciences. This is a tough audience. And one of the things that I talk about in this class is climate change. I'm a physical scientist. I study how the environment changes from year to year, from decade to decade, and longer. And one of the things I show my students is the same thing that everybody who has my job shows students. We show them a graph like this that illustrates how the temperature of our planet has changed since we started making measurements about 1880, the late 19th century. This is the way I show students in my class how the planet they live on has changed. And I know that as a scientist, I look at graphs like this all the time. And this is familiar to me, and it's really easy for me to read. And it may be true for some of the students in the class. But I know that that doesn't work for everybody, that this is not necessarily the best way to get across this idea that our planet has changed since the late 19th century. So a couple years ago, I started talking about this problem, how to communicate climate science to undergrads with an undergrad, Dan. Dan is an undergrad. He was a student in that class a couple of years ago, and now he's a major in geography. And Dan worked in our lab in the Center of Dendrochronology as a research assistant. We had him preparing samples over here in the wood shop. But I knew that Dan had a background in music. He was a bass and cello player. So I asked him to take this, which is the numbers underlaying the graph that I showed you before, the numbers that describe how the temperature of our planet has changed since the 1880s, and turn it into music.
And I'll just jump in and add that I wholeheartedly agree with Scott. And in my first interaction with him in his course, I can recall very well some of the best reactions from the students who were sitting around me. And they came not necessarily when they were looking at a slide of a graph of temperature change, but when they were looking at something really, really cool, whether it be a video or some other sort of animated graphic. And that really, it sparked the way of thinking about different ways to represent data and to represent the science that we devote our careers to investigating. And when you look at a data set like this, it's just to the eye a bunch of numbers. And the task really becomes to find a different way to communicate it and be able to communicate it effectively to a very broad range of people and be able to instill in them some understanding of exactly what all of these numbers are saying.
So I gave this to Dan. This is data that's collected by NASA describing how the temperature of our planet has changed over the last 130 years. And Dan took this temperature data and turned it into music. So can you tell the audience here a little bit about what this is?
Sure. This is the piece that I composed. I called it The Song of Our Warming Planet. And the way I went about it was very much just arithmetic, mathematical operation. I looked at the range of data that was represented in the temperatures going back all the way to 1880, so quite a long range, and it is a good time span to capture how temperature has changed over time, especially getting into the modern period. And looking at exactly how much those temperatures have changed over that entire time period, it gives you like a range. And what I had to do after that was define a musical range to correspond to it. And I've been playing the cello since I was about 9 years old, so it's been quite a big part of my life. And I chose to go with a pretty simple approach and just make the coolest temperature in that record the lowest note on my cello, the open C string. And from there, just to have the highest note represent 3 octaves above that on my cello. So this entire span of temperature change could really be represented by just 3 octaves on my instrument. And from there, I was really able to do this because the musical scale is linear, just like the temperature scale. If you go up on a piano key by key, the pitch changes at a constant rate, just like as you go up 1 degree Celsius and another degree Celsius, it changes at a constant rate.
So numbers and sound are interchangeable.
Exactly.
So if you can take a set of numbers, you can turn it into a sound. Mm-hmm. And then you can record it.
Right.
So we recorded it. We went over to the School of Music, and Mike Duffy was very careful guiding us through the process of recording this song that Dan composed. And for a while we had this recording, this 3-minute recording of Dan playing 130 years of temperature data on his cello. And we were really lucky because at that point I sent it to a fellow named John Foley. John is the head scientist of the university's Institute on the Environment. So I sent the demo to John, and he got really excited. And he said, well, he's really excited. But more importantly, John said, and I'll pay for a videographer to follow the guy with the cello around and make a video. So we spent, I guess the 3 of us spent a morning over in the School of Music where Dan was interviewed talking about his climate music composition and then recorded the performance. And then we put it online.
That's right.
So at that point, we had a video, we had the composition. Did you have any idea what you were about to get into?
I had absolutely no idea what I was about to get into. At the time when we were able to put this video online and have a finished product of what we were trying to create, that was a point where we were thinking, okay, this is
we've succeeded.
Yeah, we've succeeded.
It's on the internet.
Created this thing, and it's out there for people to see. But what we never expected to happen was what was going to come after that, and how many people were going to wind up listening to it, watching it.
Listening to you. All right, so we're going to play you the video. It's, I think, about 4 minutes long. We'll play you the video, and then we'll tell you a little bit about what happened after we posted it online.
I was in a class with Professor Scott St. George in the geography department, and at one point he posted a slide advertising for interns in his dendrochronology lab, and I was lucky enough to get that job. He came to me with a set of data with the task of turning it into a piece of music, and we wound up with a song of our warming planet. In the piece of music, each note will correspond to a year, and then the pitch of that note will represent the temperature of that year. So then these really high pitches, that would be a warmer year, and then the lower pitches would be a cooler year. for Space Studies at NASA. It's a compilation of global annual surface air temperatures. Climate scientists have a standard toolbox to communicate their data. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to add another tool to that toolbox, another way to communicate these ideas to the people who might get more out of this than out of maps, graphs, and numbers. Climate change is a defining issue of our generation, and it's still something that a lot of people don't fully understand. And what we're trying to do is to represent with the music sort of the immediacy and the importance that this issue has right now. And if we act on that, then maybe it won't be as much of an issue for the future. All right, so after we were able to have that up on the internet, we were able to see it just start popping up in different places.
Well, first it showed up on the university's website, which was nice. And then it showed up in the New York Times. And I think that this was the day after it came out. I sent a note, an email to the communications director at INE saying, we really had 10,000 people see this today? And he said, yeah, 10,000 yesterday. So then it showed up. Dan did an interview with public radio in Southern California.
Yeah, Southern California.
He showed up on the Minnesota Post. This picture of Dan is all over the internet. So from this point, for the rest of his life, if you Google Dan Crawford, this is the photograph that's going to be coming up. He showed up on Fast Company, Huffington Post, Popular Science, Weather Channel. And then Twitter jumped on it. John Foley, who's a global eco guy on Twitter, for a scientist, he's got a lot of Twitter followers, so he started sharing things. And he got a response back from Mark Ruffalo, who played the Incredible Hulk. That was really exciting. It got shared by Al Gore. And for me, I'm Canadian. You may have already spotted my accent, but I grew up in Canada. So for me, a big highlight was to have Dan's composition highlighted by the Canadian News, but also Quirks and Quarks, which is the Canadian National Science Program.
And I think one of the really great things that can be seen in all of these different varieties of Twitter feeds is just the broad impact that this piece of music can have, that it can reach so many different communities on the internet, from politicians to fellow scientists to actors and musicians and bloggers. It just sort of spans the gamut of anyone who could like see the interest in it.
Yeah, I think Mike did an interview with English radio station.
It was actually, I got a phone call from India. Was one. It was an Indian print publication, and another one from England.
Yeah. So Dan also got interviewed. I think I was out of the country when this was happening, so I have avoided all these things, and Dan had to do everything. So at one point,
there was
he
a lot of
he got invited to come on the Japanese equivalent of Entertainment Tonight, which in Minnesota corresponds to what time?
That was about getting everything set up at about 3:30 a.m. and going on the air at 4 a.m. over Skype.
Yeah. And I remember after talking to you about that, you mentioned that they had some unusual questions. They talked
Right.
about the composition, but they were especially interested in how this fit into your education.
Exactly. One of the things that the hosts were questioning me about was the fact that this is a piece of work that really seems to be beyond the classroom learning aspect of college education. And you really seem to have this idea that cultures in that part of the world are very tied to the rigor and just go at it for just classroom learning and being able to dive into that, but not so much being able to sort of branch out. And it was really interesting to hear that, because it was just it was helpful to see that it could have that impact on sort of a cultural level, I would say.
Now, we should emphasize that not all of our reviews were positive. Dan actually got reviewed by the music critic of the Telegraph in London. And it's actually what they said was, "I don't know what to feel about Dan's video. Pleased that a passion for artistic creation lurks within the soul of a dendrochronologist, or astonished that a research intern would spend time on something so frivolous." What we took from this is that we got reviewed by the music critic of the London Telegraph, which is awesome. So I think it's safe to say this had an impact that was way beyond anything that we could have hoped for or imagined or planned for. This is really, like I was talking about with Seth earlier, serendipity was really driving almost everything that happened. But it was really special. And for us, one of the things that was really nice was that NASA, the agency that produced the temperature data that Dan was using as the basis for his composition, they picked up on the story and started featuring it on their Twitter and news feeds. So we thought that was a nice way of us paying them back a little bit for making some of this data available to us to work with.
And additionally, it was great just to see it go in that full circle. And I also had the opportunity over the summer to perform the piece at Science Online Climate Conference in Washington, D.C., where I was pulled aside by Gavin Schmidt from NASA, who was very pleased to hear me perform the piece and actually see that data put to good use.
Yeah. Now, I haven't taught my big class since Dan recorded this composition, so I'm really not sure how students are going to react to this in a lot of ways. But one of the comments that was my favorite was one of the articles that showed up on Slate about this. Phil Plait, the science blogger at Slate, said that sometimes converting a graph into a different form of information can deliver the message more effectively than just the dots on a page. And we don't really know, but we hope that giving the public another way of accessing this information about climate science will maybe make it a little more accessible, more open to people. And we're not really sure that we've succeeded in that, but Dan's video has been viewed about 150,000 times, which makes it it's the most successful video that the University of Minnesota has ever produced that doesn't involve flash mobs or superheroes. So we were really happy that people that might not have been engaging with this information were still seeing it. And that's what we thought was maybe the best sign of success of this project.
Right. And then when you're looking at an image like this, you can see that the take-home point would probably be that of all of the students in that class, there are bound to be a few who don't really understand the scope of what our planet is going through in the past few decades. And if we can just put this song or this video up there and be able to have them think differently about it, or actually realize what this data is representing in a new way, or a visceral way that they haven't understood before, that it might generate some mind changing and lead towards the better future that we need to get.
So that's our story. Thanks for listening, and we're happy to take questions later if we have time. We'll stick around. Thank you.
All right. Can I do this? Okay, I'm doing it. Okay. Thanks for your talk, guys. I think in a lot of ways, I'm going to be talking about some of the same issues, namely, how do we talk about data and how can we make data strange so that our attention is drawn to it in a different way? Right, so as a graph has sort of in terms of data representation has become sort of the invisible, right? The given way that we ingest scientific information, turning it into sound makes it strange for a moment and gets us to maybe think there's more to data than a chart. So I'm glad y'all started. I want to talk a little bit about, I guess, some of my work. And I come from an English department. And when we talk about, in English departments and in even the humanities, largely we talk about technology a lot, right? They're changing the ways that we teach and we research and we produce and we learn and all of that. The problem sometimes, and this has been true since at least the 1980s in terms of research, is that a lot of us start to approach technology in this way. Ooh, shiny new. Look at all the ways these technologies are propelling us into a brave, new, democratized world. We all know that that's not really happening. We can do cool things. But largely, especially when we're talking maybe about our students, we sometimes are surprised when we discover that they are not the tech whizzes that we thought they would be. Rather, they're pretty good consumers. In other words, what we're doing, I mean, culturally and certainly within the academic world, many of us, and I've certainly been guilty of this, is reperforming these sort of techno-utopian rhetorics, right? This is from an old typewriter manual from the 1970s, right? User-friendliness is born. We're taught that machines can do things for us and so on. And then certainly, too, it just works, right? One of Apple's famous sayings, right? Things just work. You can trust it. In fact, on this image is cut. The original text reads, "Confide in the Adler J5. The machine will show you everything by itself," right? And so what my work in terms of both scholarship and creative work has been largely concerned with is disrupting the narratives and the interfaces that say, I am technology, I am clean, I am noiseless, I am democratic, I am functional, because they aren't always functional, are they? And so a lot of folks have been dealing with these issues in the art world. So I'll tell you a little bit about how I've been engaging in that. So paying no attention to the man behind the curtain has turned many of us into consumers of technology. In other words, the materiality, right? The fact that data and that technologies were built with specific purposes, with specific subjectivities, with specific limitations and so on. In other words, they're not just tools to do something, right? There's not always just an app for that, despite what we've been told. Oh, I can get online. I don't need that right now. Really wants me to, though. And so how then creatively and how intellectually can I start thinking about disrupting these narratives of cleanliness? Well, there's a long history in the arts, particularly if you want to talk about like Dada and Oulipo, Fluxus. How do we interrupt these streams of uncritical engagement with tech, with language, with and so on? And so some of the work that I've done have been trying to disrupt some of these ways of thinking about things as static, as tool only. Does anybody here know about circuit bending? This has been around for a long time, at least since the 1960s, pioneered by Reed Ghazala. And so if you don't know what circuit bending is, this doesn't deal with data necessarily, or at least in the same way that I'll talk about it in a moment. But go to a thrift store sometime and buy one of these old speak and spells or keyboards and crack it open a bit and say, okay, there are some sounds that Yamaha wanted me to make with this, but I can make some other sounds. And so by a series of creative short circuit, you can get some different things. Oh, and now I'll wish I had connected, but maybe it's already loaded. Right, so finding these moments of failure, finding these moments of malfunction can not only teach me a lot about making new noise, but can also teach us a lot about the tools that we're given, right? No longer am I limited to the black keys and the white keys and the crappy presets of the Yamaha PSS 11. But we can make new instruments and learn a little bit about ourselves as a society engaging with technology in the process. But we can go beyond physical devices. We can also start to think about digital images. And so, take an image, any image, and what do I get? I get a visual representation of that data, but I can do something else too. I don't always need to open it with what my device says I should view this JPEG with, but I can open it in something like a text editor. Has anybody ever done this? Hi. Okay, this is another way to think about that image. And if I get rid of a whole bunch of it and put some Ys, I can change the way that image looks, right? So this is all about getting past consumer presets and interpretations of data, and all about digging a little bit deeper, as just in the same way that you can crack open a piano and mess with it, you can do the same thing with data. You can open this in the hex editor. You can open this in Audacity. Audacity can understand this raw data just as well as Preview can. So I'll talk about a different project that I'm working on, and I'm not really timing myself. I hope that's not an issue. You got me? All right. Okay, so a lot of us consume video, digital video. Who watches Netflix? Streaming? 3 people, 5, 7, 9. Okay. Hulu, right? Hulu Plus or Amazon or whatever. We're, of course, consuming these products under the promise of this works and it's awesome, and I can do it on my phone or my iPad or my computer or my Apple TV. But sometimes that doesn't work. Did anybody try to watch the season opener of Game of Thrones? No, I'm the only person who watches it. Anyway, HBO Go was overloaded in much the same way as the season finale of True Detective was. And sometimes, of those 8 people, I refuse to believe you're the only ones who watch Netflix online. Does anything bad ever happen when you watch it? Anything? Like what can happen?
The syncing of the voice to the video.
Yeah, sometimes it's an error message, but sometimes it's something more fun. Now, when we start talking about digital video, we have to start talking about what digital video is. It's not a bunch of images on magnetic film. Instead, in order to make digital video consumable, we've had to compress it. We've had to try to keep quality as high as we can, but make the file as small as we can. And this is typically done in a couple of ways, right? Either removing non-essential data or removing redundant data. Now, this of course is because we want smooth and functional media entertainment. Until, as you said, sometimes what we call compression artifacts start to show up. This happens to me often on things like Hulu, where things bleed into each other. One scene bleeds into the next. So I like seeing that because I go, oh, I'm watching media on a device that's planned and created for me to consume it as seamlessly as possible, right? Not think about what I'm doing, watch it. So sad face. But sad face moments, a lot like vegetables, are good for you. In my view and in my work, to think about critical consumption and prosumer culture, in other words, that we not only can consume, but we can make and we can alter, and to try to break outside of the loop of upgrade culture, right? That I must have the newest version of X, Y, or Z. In other words, that I'm consuming things, but I'm doing it thoughtfully and I'm doing it critically. And so how then, as an artist, can I provoke sad face moments? If you know anything about MPEG compression standards, you'll know that there are basically, we could talk about B frames too, but for purposes of this, I'll talk about I frames and P frames, and this is how digital video works under MPEG compression standards. So there are 2 types of frames. One is an I frame, and this is essentially an image, okay? It's what you see on a screen. It's often an opening shot or when you move to a different scene. It's this first shot. Frames that come after that are P-frames, and they're not independent images, right? Because we're trying to save space. We're trying to make these files small. So all we need to do in a P-frame is measure what changes from that initial frame. If you're not coming with me, I'll take you there soon. So I-frames and P-frames, they keep our viewing experience smooth and nice and clean, unless you data bend. And so this is essentially, and I won't take you through the entire process, but they're using very simple open source and free tools to go in and take a video and remove those I-frames, right? So if everything after the first frame is dependent on what came before it, you start to get these sort of bled through images that you sometimes see, and you can make that happen on purpose. And so let me show you a couple of examples of this type of work. And again, sort of the ideas behind this, of course, are trying to reveal the materiality of digital video. So which one is this? So I've worked with these in a couple of different scenarios. The audio you were hearing were from contact or coil pickup microphones. These were designed in the 1950s. You'd put them on your handset of your telephone, and it would help you record conversations. So this was like do-it-yourself phone surveillance. But what they do is they interpret data much differently than our ear, right? They pick up electromagnetic energy, and they can sonify that. Now with the phone, this was a very practical application. You could simply get the sound transmitted through the earpiece and the mouthpiece. But if you start putting those microphones on computers and other things, you start to get a different sort of sound, a way of approaching these technologies and these devices sound. And so when my iPhone is at its most silent, right, when an application is loading, that is when it is the loudest and noisiest with one of these devices placed on it. And so for a recent piece I did at the Plains Art Museum in Fargo, I reinterpreted or corrupted Tarkovsky's Solaris, the film. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's certainly a beautiful film, and it's hailed as such. And so I wanted to, in the words of Chuck Palahniuk, I wanted to destroy something beautiful. And so what I set up are a couple of TV screens as two different ways to see this media, and headphones that were featuring these coil pickup microphones all over televisions and DVD players, even lighting within the installation. So giving us a different way, certainly, to start thinking about watching a movie. So essentially, I perform these techniques on these films, again, in much the same way, or for the same reasons as the folks before me, right? To make watching a film a very alien, weird experience, to ask us all to reflect a little bit more on the consumption of digital media, but certainly not limited to digital. How do we consume? What do we consume? And what are the principles and the politics underneath the distribution and the creation of those texts? I've got 5, but that's all I really have to say. So I'll just say thanks, and we'll talk later.
So I need to plug it in. I do not need sound. So I'm Jan Estep. I'm a professor in the art department here, and I occasionally teach a philosophy of art class in the philosophy department. So I don't recognize any of my students. I didn't announce it, so sorry about that, Justin. I am a visual artist and also a writer, and I have an expanded creative practice. I work in a lot of media. I'm showing you just 2 of the various things that I do, and I'm very interested in thought, in thinking, in consciousness, and how it is that we perceive the world, understand the world, how it is to be embodied in the way that we're embodied, how that all happens, and yet I make art at the same time. And so I'm always moving between the sort of intellectual, cerebral, ephemeral, and the material, embodied, physical, and that dynamic, which I think is perfectly human, is also what drives a lot of my artwork as well. There's something so insubstantial about thought, trying to categorize it or grab it or hold on to it. I mean, language does a really good job of doing that, but yet it's gone, it's insubstantial. And at the same time, it shapes and influences so much of how we experience the world. So that kind of confounds me in a very interesting, positive way in terms of being a maker. I've addressed this dynamic of how we perceive the world, how we understand the world, in a number of ways that I'm going to show you today. One way, and I'm just going to flip through these really quickly, they're available at Printed Matter if you want to, or I have them if you ever want them, are a series of maps that I've made that involved a site visit to specific locations in the world, and then I translate that embodied experiential on-the-ground experience into a distillation of what that is into an accessible, communicable form for others. I've done 4 of these maps so far. One of them has been searching down the hut that Ludwig Wittgenstein, a philosopher, built in the early part of the 20th century. It's in Norway. It had never been, these places had never been mapped before. I'm showing you the front and the back of the maps. The second project was investigated land art out in western Utah, Robert Smithson, Nancy Holt in particular. I mentioned a few others, and I did my own intervention into the landscape with text as well on site. That's the front and the back. And the third in this particular form, I just published last year, searching for Everett Roos, who was a young naturalist who, at the beginning of the 20th century, disappeared down a Davis Gulch out in Utah. So I retraced his steps and did some interventions on site. And then this last map is Grand Canyon suicide map that chronicles all the known suicides that have been recorded in the Grand Canyon area, which expands across northern Utah. And this is a detailed shot. Most of the deaths and suicides cluster in the national park. Which has always been very fascinating to me, that the place that tourists go to be awe-inspired by that amazing landscape that is so much larger and magnificent than we are, also is a place where people go in utter despair and pain. So switching, what I'll mainly focus on today is the terrain, the newly navigable terrain of the brain, what brain sciences have allowed us to investigate, how the brain functions. And people have been studying the brain for centuries, of course, but with MRI data in particular, we have a non-invasive way of studying the active living brain, not the dead brain or a monkey brain, but the human brain in cognitive states, performing cognitive tasks. This interest of really trying to reconcile, it's a very similar interest to me of sort of have this internal processing of an external world. How does that happen? The brain is central to that. Mind is central to that. So it makes a lot of sense to me that I would be interested in the brain as a part of the body that helps us make sense of the sensations we receive. And I, just by accident, met Wilma Kustal, who's a psychology professor here at the U, who studies Alzheimer's and memory, and I mean, she's amazing, so smart. And I just was sitting next to her at a faculty meeting, and I had one of those Think Hard that I showed you at the front. I had a Think Hard sticker on my notebook. She's like, what is that? What does it mean to think hard? I'm like, oh, I like you. That's a good question. What does it mean to think hard? What does it mean to think soft? What does it mean to think easy? What does it mean to think? Darn it. And she also happens to be very interested in contemporary art and photography in particular. And so we hit it off just in the kind of casual way. And when the Institute for Advanced Study here on campus, IAS, put out a call for The Body and Knowing, something like that. It was years ago. Put out a call for grants. We wrote a grant together. This was in 2009, and got a little bit of funding to design a study, an fMRI study, to study language and how the brain processes semantic tasks. And I just shadowed the team, her team, as she developed that. And science, compared to art, science is so slow. So they're just now crunching the data, their data that they got from this process. But for 2 years, I was involved in the preparation of their study, coming up with norms, coming up what region of the brain are they going to study, looking at the available research and all of the questions that scientists take into account to do proper research in their field. And in our group, one hypothesis was that the way the brain processes abstract language is much more fundamentally tied to physical processes than most people have suggested. And you likely know the Cartesian gloss, I think, therefore I am, this real distillation or kind of separation of the mind and body. And this is a group, that's being broken down very quickly, but that still resonates for a lot of people, how our intellectual, do we get in this talk, like I'm making this distinction between what the mind does and what the body does in a very kind of quick, glossy way, knowing that they're always interrelated and integrated. But so that's one of the hypotheses we were studying. And for this particular study, they were designing a functional magnetic resonance imaging study where they would scan people in the scanner, and I'll show you a picture in a second of what the scanner looks like as they're processing language. What you're looking at here are scans of my brain that I got, like these CDs of all these images of my brain. And as an artist, it's like, great, now what do I do with that? I don't know what to do with that. I knew I wanted to make art from this experience and this collaboration, but I had no idea what I would make. My maps are often like that. I don't know what I'll make till I get on site and actually see what the world gives me in this regard. But I was one of the test subjects for the study, and I was also the test subject for the pilot study. And they didn't even have to pay me, right? So I'm just sort of like wanting the experience of being in the scanner and see what that is. And then also with the hope of having some data, visual data that I can work with afterwards in some way. And I'll show you those in a moment. One way I've worked with them. This is, the campus has 2 Tesla scanners on campus. This is not one of theirs, it's just an image I grabbed from the internet of what it looks like, in case you've not seen what those look like. They're mainly, the MRI visualizes the change in blood oxygen when your brain is processing different tasks in front of it. And it collects the data, the change, because of hemoglobin and the magnetic properties of the body. There's a way that it can collect minute changes as you're actually processing or cognizing something. The scanner collects all that data, it's numerical data, and then they're algorithmically processed to create an image. But the scientists know how to read those sheets of data. So they could just look at the data and be like, I can't make any sense of that. But very early on in the development of MRI scanning technology, they found a way to make an image of it because we had radiologists already trained. We had people accustomed to reading images. But the people working with it can read the numerical assessment as well as the visual assessment. And the scanner takes, this sounds very kind of violent almost, but it scans in slices of the brain, very small, thin slices of the brain, both along X, Y, and Z axis, and it's doing that all at the same time. So this is just a general sense of the kind of image, the concretizing way that they're gathering image. And I wanted to just give you a little taste of what it was like to be in the scanner. So you're laying down in the scanner, and you have to be perfectly still because any movement throws off the data collection, right? It's misread, and so it's really good if you're calm, not claustrophobic. And there's a laptop in the back and a little mirror, and so your head is like in an encase, and it's very loud. It's knocking very loudly. And so you have protective ear devices, but there's still sound to the tech guys in case you need to have some instructions or are panicking. There's also a panic button to your left non-dominant hand that you can press to get out of there quick if you want, because it's in a long tunnel. It can be unnerving for someone who is claustrophobic. And in your right hand, you have some movement in your finger that you can say yes, no, right, left. So there's a very kind of minimal way that you can interact and respond to what you're looking at. In our task, we were looking at abstract and concrete language, more and less complex, different modalities, and just observing the brain, what's happening in the brain when you're analyzing these materials. So the task here was, given the top word, which of the bottom words is most like it? Right? So that's your task. I'm going to just show you a few very quickly. In the scanner, they're happening very quickly because you get one shot. You don't get to think and deliberate. They just want to know what you're doing. And so you feel that a little bit. It's like a really souped up, kind of analytical test. But I love those, so it was really fun for me to be in the scanner. So I hope you enjoy this. So again, the task is, given the top, which of the bottom is most like it? You'd press your index finger for the left, your middle finger for the right. So did you feel your brain thinking? Right? And this crosshair is a visual rest. And so the MRI always works by comparing two states, a before and after. You're processing this or processing that or processing this and then resting. And so when you're observing this crosshair, the assumption is you're just using the visual cortex in the back, right? The visual areas, and you're not interpreting or responding or engaging the semantic areas. So they're just using that as a test control. The examples, I think if you could feel that a little bit, see that, they range from easy to hard in terms of complexity or modality, and each category of concrete versus abstract. And then I noticed when I was running the test, and you run multiple sessions of this, coming back for multiple visits, some were very immediate, and I just sort of like, okay, go, next one. And then others, I had this little narrative going on for justifying, why is the crow like the pigeon because it's a bird, or is it like the spider because it's black? And I'm like, oh, no, I just have to, and there's no right or wrong per se. It's just that activity is being monitored, how you're working there. So the MRI and fMRI, they're increasing. Again, it's only about a 20-year-old diagnostic tool, really. It's very young still, and there's still a lot of openness about what exactly it's chronicling or showing us. But the anatomical MRI images, and this is what you're looking at here, they're being used to study, for example, Alzheimer's. So mainly they're being used to study disease states with the hope that understanding the diseased brain will understand and help embody, or ennoble the healthy brain, the healthy cognitive function. So here there's a before and after MRI scans of someone with Alzheimer's, and you can see the loss of brain matter in the 7 years that they're tracking the changes going on in the brain. And then with functional resonance imaging, I just have an example of one way they're using it is to study schizophrenic brains. There's been a lot of interest, both in depression and schizophrenia. There have been a lot of studies in these areas. You can see how much less function is going on, less processing going on in the bottom row, which is the schizophrenic brain, compared to the top row, which is the quote-unquote normal brain or non-schizophrenic brain. And there's less cognitive processing in the prefrontal cortex, which is used to, it's got 9 or so functions, but one of the functions is to reflect about self. And less of that is going on in the schizophrenic brain. Studies have also emphasized how the emotional brain influences our actions, so that what we might better understand the way anger, anxiety, and fear affect our decisions we make, economic decisions, personal decisions, consumption decisions. I mean, they're studying everything to try to get a leg up on what influences people when they make these kinds of decisions. And it's in this area that I've had the strongest expectations or desires for what the brain scans might show me. what they might reveal. For me, understanding things conceptually has always been my default mode. I've spent a lot of time training this brain of mine to think in the way that it thinks. But in the last few years, I've been giving a lot more attention to my emotional sensitivity to the world and cultivating that and trying to balance that out. And I just thought this scientific collaboration was a great way to get information of a sort that I was not going to get anywhere else. Again, these are images of my brain, anatomical images. And so feeling like the collaboration offered this great chance, I went to Wilma. I'm like, I laughed because she kept laughing at me every time I asked this really naive question, like, can the brain scans show me where my emotions are? She's like, Jan. No, that's not how it works. It's not like a lie detector test or a truth serum test. That's not how, we don't have that level of information yet for what's going on. They understand that certain areas help process emotions, but that's very different from some kind of verification system, which is what I was looking for. But she did help me come up with a pilot study, and it's based on that phrase, thinking is hard, or so takes the form Xing is hard, some verb is hard. And it ran the gamut from running is hard to crying is hard, using both abstract and concrete verbs, some of which were more emotionally charged than others. So in the following images, again, I'm going to give you a small sample of what that test was like, the pilot study was like. All you have to answer is yes or no. Thinking is hard, yes or no. And again, you in the scanner, you'd be laying there just toggling yes or no, having the experience that you're experiencing. I have too many slides to show you. So this is a functional image, a fMRI image of my brain, contrasting the control states for the non-emotional verbs versus the emotional states, the emotional verbs that I was processing. And you can see that there are different areas in the brain being engaged, right? So in the emotional one, there's the different areas compared to the non-emotional one. So like, you know that, right? But here's an image of that. So again, this question of what exactly am I looking at? What exactly can these show be? What do neuroimages reveal to us? Laden that on with my desire for them to reveal a specific thing, which they can't yet do, given the sort of the newness of the science itself and the technology itself. And then I'll end with these images that I did collect all of the images of my brain, and for a long while I did not know how to work with them, and these are really young. This is only less than a year old that I've been making these drawings, but I did decide that I wanted to draw like physically into these digital images. The images are so minimal, they're so factual, they don't really show very much, and there's that kind of loss to me or lack to me was really motivating some kind of physical material intervention, so I started drawing. And I haven't drawn for 20 years. That's not a kind of regular part of my practice, but it's a very, for me, it was a very literally hands-on way to get into my brain, which sounds kind of creepy, but also like the brain is plastic, right? It's very plastic. And so I started these drawings a little less than a year ago, and I'm going to show you a handful of them. I'm not going to give a lot of commentary. They're much more intuitively done. It's kind of emotionally responding to the image on that day. They're usually done they're almost all done in one sitting. And I'm really just responding to the image and also responding to my kind of mental state at the time. The limited color palette of black, white, and yellow. And they seem to be battling it out, the positive and the negative energies. For me, a lot of the drawings are responding to a kind of energy, an energy that's in the body, an energy that's held in the mind, an energy that's being released or restricted. That's how I'm kind of sort of giving some language to how it feels to make these. And some of them are also responding to the energetic kind of forces that are more relational, interpersonal as well. So when I'm working back into the digital MRI, it's always to suggest what's not yet present in the image, what's missing. I'm responding to that minimal nature of the factual image. But as much as these drawings are an emotional exploration for me personally, the underlying issues are still deeply philosophical. That's what I started this talk today about. How do the mind and body relate to one another? How is our phenomenal experience retained and processed by the body-mind? How does our sensory experience relate to the conceptual? How are mental states such as thoughts and emotions held in the brain, generated by the brain? Is the mind reducible to the brain, merely epiphenomenal as some scientists claim? Or can the mind affect and shape the brain? What is the connection between mind, body, brain, and world? There's so much we still don't understand about what it means to be conscious, what it means to have a brain of the cognitive abilities that we have, and about experience. So that uncertainty has driven a lot of my work, and I'm just really grateful I have all these ways to explore it. So I'm going to end with this beautiful child perfectly at ease in her brain-body contraption here. Thank you.
So now we're going to have a discussion with the panelists. I'm going to pull this off the side, guys, for a seat wherever you'd like.
Is this one on? Y'all. Okay.
I've got a few questions, but I want to hear from y'all first. Floor is open. What do you want to ask? It's Minnesota. No one wants to ask the first question. You can make me ask the first question. There are obviously connections between yours, and one of them that people kept talking about materiality in different ways, whether we're trying to reveal the materiality or make this, more tangibly apparent with a cello. And so I wonder maybe if you could talk about why that's important now, and maybe in your own projects and perhaps generally as the swarms of data flowing around us that are not necessarily the new thing, but getting so much attention in so many different fields.
I could speak to the idea of using the cello as an instrument to sort of reframe the data, so that it's a familiar instrument that has a very human vocal quality that is approachable and relatable to someone who's just hearing this. It's abstract in that, so there's no signification necessarily outside of the frame that we're sort of placing upon it. So the data is presented through this vehicle, and it's both, I think representing the data, I think, is a big part of what it is.
Yeah, I could I could add to that briefly, just in terms of that project, that really the real material thing is the data itself and what it's coming from. It's just this measure of temperature, just at the simplest deconstruction, the kinetic energy of what's going on in the atmosphere. And that by itself isn't necessarily the most useful way to get at interpreting these problems. And I guess in that sense, getting away from that pure materiality of what this data is coming from would be like the goal of transforming it into a piece of music.
I also thinking that you just talked about there is a materiality to all of this data as well. That this is coming from temperature changes and things out in the real world. But I think what motivated this question for me was that there is a kind of, because it's in this form that students have seen and we've all seen for a long time, line graphs, like it has a sort of like invisibleness almost, invisibility, because it's so familiar.
Yeah,
I think one of the big concepts behind my scholarship and my art is this idea of black boxedness, right? Where we understand input maybe as keystrokes, we understand output as text on a Microsoft Word file, but all of the invisible processes in the middle not only obscure themselves for the sake of user friendliness or functionality, but also obscure the biases in terms of the way we are supposed to think about text, the way that we're supposed to make things, the way that we're supposed to use language, the ways that we're supposed to write. And so, I think the materiality I'm talking about is not only something to touch or to see represented in some way, but that all materials have this inherent subjectivity, the politics sort of obscured within operations and so on.
And I would add to that art historically has always made things strange. I loved your comment about that. That's one of its primary functions, to take something we might take for granted and flip it on its head, to look at it differently, to understand it differently. And I think I would say what you just said in slightly different language, that once you take something for granted, you often are totally unaware of your implicit assumptions that allow that to be factual or ordinary or familiar to you. Right? You just normalize how you think about the world. And I think a lot of what we're doing in very different ways is trying to flip that around. Like, what are you assuming for this to make sense? So for example, in my really naive way, can't the brain scan show me where my emotion is? Like, we think brain scans are like x-rays. They're not at all like x-rays. It's like this completely manufactured image. But if you don't understand that, and most people don't, I didn't, right? If you don't understand that, you think it's this kind of objective, not subjective, reliable, evidentiary look at what's going on. It's like, no, there's so many decisions behind that looking like it's looking, and trying to make sense of that, not to overwhelm individuals, because if you're always conscious of every little thing that's behind you, you don't get out the door, right? But in moments, use the materiality to make it strange. I love that comment, or just to get you to think about what actually is informing this. Culturally, personally, what's informing this?
John?
My question is kind of about that, making it strange. The environmental scientists seem to kind of, responses to making it strange have a positive impact on their data. In fact, that it shows people in a different way, the changes in these temperatures. It hits a different register. I was wondering if the other two artists had similar encounters when they went back to be like the original data creators, maybe like neuroscientists or computer coders or filmmakers. Are you getting the same type of response, or are you getting any response? Have you shared with any? That's what
the small team, the small team that I work with, they're very interested in art, and so they're open. Some people aren't open to art, so this is a team that totally welcomed me into their midst and thought it was really cool to have someone who doesn't think like them. because I ask questions that they do not ask, right? It's like, what? Like, we never ask that question. Here I am asking a question they would never ask anymore. And so there's a kind of, there's a tolerance for that and an interest in that, but I don't think like they do, right? And so that it does break down in certain ways, just like everybody is disciplined in their field, and so they're at this level, and so there is a little bit of that. But I think in general, and I haven't made these drawings public yet, so they're still, I mean, you just saw them, but I haven't, you know, I don't know if it's a work of mine yet. I'm kind of, it's still too new. I don't know what it is. So I'm protecting it a little bit from too much public exposure, but you can feel free to say whatever you want to say. I shared them with the philosophy of science group here on campus in January, and I got a positive response. There were some people who were critical, who think I'm like the drawing, so I'll just share that with you, that the drawings gain importance because of the scientific imagery. Right? Because people have been making emotional intuitive drawings forever, right? And that I'm somehow like getting extra credit because the scientific imagery. And so it's like, well, yeah, I could see that, but I'm responding to that scientific image. These wouldn't exist. I would never draw like that if I were not responding to that scientific image. So for me, it's like, I see your point, but for me, they're totally resulting from this data that I have and how to work with it.
With my stuff, it's on one side or the other, right? Here's an anecdote. The piece I have in the museum right now, I've received 3 calls from the curator saying, your glitch piece isn't working, okay? And it's not because the design, right, the television's working, the DVD player working, it's not because it had a glitch aesthetic, because that's certainly gaining popularity. Kanye West had a data moshed video a few years ago and so on. But what was happening in the gallery was that first, one of the DVD players I was using died. Like, it doesn't read discs anymore. It was old and it doesn't work. Now, if I want to be like ideologically honest, I say, let it break. That's the point, right? They say, no, you got to get in here and we need a new DVD player. And then one of the outputs was faulty on the new DVD player, so I went in again. The third time, somebody had messed with my audio mixer. So I've spent more time like fixing the glitch, right? Because the glitch is curated, it's stylized, and it's aestheticized. And this is something in the glitch art community that's pretty contentious, right? Because what's a real glitch, or what's, we'll sometimes call them like domesticated glitches, or are you using presets, or are you just finding them in the wild? It's either, in other words, somebody's always bored and mad and happy and like, ooh, that's new, which kind of again goes against the sort of principles underneath it, going like, oh, that's cool. How can I make that with an app? And there are apps for glitch, which is, so I don't know.
Yeah, Seth?
Yeah, so you can see I brought a lot of the undergrads today. This is my class in Internet Global Society in journalism and mass communication. And one of the reasons we came is partly because, for a couple of reasons, but we studied data in relation to sort of the Internet and how people use the Internet for various types of purposes, and it's kind of the data and sort of underlying architecture of that and the social and cultural aspects of the Internet. I wonder if we might hear from some of you about the notion of kind of the end user and their role in this process, and just maybe just articulating a bit more about what, we've looked at some of the material and sort of material aspects and possibilities associated with those, but what is the idealized role of the end user, sort of the everyday person using the Internet, particularly in a sort of a global context? I mean, as far as, maybe I can clarify that, in terms of these types of activities, what should we reasonably expect someone to do, and with what sort of impact as far as raising certain types of awareness for certain types of understanding?
I think one of the audiences that I was thinking about when I initially told Dan to get his cello and go make a composition was actually other scientists. Because about a week ago, there was a big UN report, the third report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They have big meetings in Brussels, and they release the findings of the latest assessment of the state of our planet, which is always terrible. But the way that they communicate is usually through PowerPoint presentations and very complex technical diagrams and lots of words on the screen. And as a scientist who studies climate change, even I'm bored by that. So one of the hopes that we had for our project was to get scientists to think a little more creatively about how to communicate the main ideas that they're trying to get across to the broader public. Because, like Dan said in the video, we have a certain set of tools. We, being scientists, have a certain set of tools that we use. It's usually gets boiled down to a person in front of a screen talking about a very technical diagram. And that's effective at communicating with some people, but it leaves a lot of other people cold. So we were hoping to use Dan's work as an example to get scientists of thinking just to try something different and to see what happens, to experiment with communicating about science in the same way that we experiment with science.
I wonder, Dan, if you could say a little more about how you got those numbers to match up with those notes and like the relationships between because this is a project I'm working on right now too, of translating data into sound as well. So you mentioned this, the lowest string and 3 octaves above that.
Yeah, I wasn't very clear about that. The process really involved, it boiled down to trying to figure out exactly how much of a change in temperature would be required for the music to move up 1/2 step. So as I was going through and looking at the data and understanding the musical range I had to work with, you could really just divide the entire range of notes. I was working with 36 halftones for 3 octaves. Divide that by the range of temperature, and it wound up to being about 0.3 something degrees Celsius change would result in the next note. And when it gets boiled down to that, it's just it was a long process of just going through year by year all the way back to 1880 and looking at the temperature and having an understanding of just based on that value what note it would represent, starting with the lowest note on the cello and going all the way up to the top of that 3rd octave.
Okay. And I'm wondering about, oh yeah, go ahead, Scott.
Just to follow up on that, was there any, since this is an advocacy piece as well as a communicative piece, was there any thought about doing the projection until you just hit the point which you can't hear anymore? Maybe that would have been, I could have seen that as being perhaps emotionally compelling to the point where there's no more sound, there's no more existence.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess in terms of that, I was limited by the instrument I was working with, not being able to exactly reach that point. But I think Mike might be able to speak a bit more about the sort of future possibilities that this could hold, and he's more of a music dude than I am.
I mean, it doesn't have the effect of bumping Smurfs or anything like that, but it's something that
I'm going to jump on that a little bit. One of the reasons why, I think that I won't hurt Dan's feelings. One of the reasons why Dan's composition is kind of boring is because it's by design. Mm-hmm. It's very straightforward. There's nothing the musicality of it is pretty limited. But that was because we were really concerned that people would be very critical of just the act of turning climate science data into music. So we wanted things to be as transparent as possible. The algorithm that he designed is on the internet for anyone to look at if they want to see exactly how the conversion was made. We were very clear about what we were doing so that we were guarding against some possible criticism about misrepresenting the data in some way.
Or aestheticizing it.
Avoiding the sort of application of affect. Yeah, really.
I mean, it involves that to a degree inevitably. He's playing climate music on his cello. But we were really concerned that we stick to as plain vanilla as possible so that people could directly see the connection between the data and the product.
But then getting back again to the end goal, what I've created or what this product was is just really the basis of there can be a lot more work done with this, and it's just like the basis that can be expanded upon. And there have been other researchers who have taken this work and expanded on it more creatively, like a violinist from the University of Wisconsin Green Bay made a much more, I suppose, aesthetically pleasing version of this piece to sort of get at that larger audience, perhaps, or just make it more resonant with them.
DJ Spooky did something. Have you seen his work on like glacial melting and so on? Mm-hmm. And super aestheticized, by the way, to coincide with his book. But.
So, well, and less aestheticized actually. So John Luther Adams won the Pulitzer the other day. He has an installation. It's called a place where you go to listen, I believe, and it's a variety of sonifications of star charts and temperature readings and different things in Alaska. He lives out in the country in Alaska and is very sort of tuned into natural things, and this is a big part of his practice. And so this, I mean, it is it's an installation in Fairbanks, I believe, in their art museum, and it's a room that runs 24 hours a day, representing certain aspects of what's going on outside.
Stephen, would you? I mean, I saw a presentation by someone, Natalie Miebach, who's a really wonderful visual artist and weaver, and she has these incredible pieces that are built around the cycles of day and night in Boston over 4 years. And she was very concerned about this question of not necessarily being true to the data, because if you're being absolutely true to the data, you're not doing any of this at all. And I wonder, Stephen, if you think, I mean, you've shown how you are aligned with some of these things, but I wonder also if you are messing with that relationship as well to it. I mean, you're not being true to the data, but you are in a certain sense. I wonder if you could talk about that.
I don't know. So you're asking me, in what sense do I, like representation of the original artifact and what I do with that?
Yeah, and the kind of transformations, the way you see your transformations of it, as opposed to some of these other ones that are still trying to communicate something about the data, but also kind of, I would say, like kind of opposed to something like that as well. I see that tension in your work.
Yeah, so I mean, I think direct representation is one of the things that I'm trying to confront. And that is to say that at least traditional ways of saying, how do I represent something, whether it's a feeling or a word or a film, how do I, the trend broadly, culturally, in upgrade culture is to make that as invisible as possible. I mean, at base, I'm trying to just disrupt that a little bit. Now, that could just be a moment where you're watching a movie or whatever, or it could be a friend of mine in Paris who created a little program, and he takes it into Apple stores and loads them on all their computers so that they don't work the way they're supposed to work. So there is kind of a guerrilla aspect of this. I'm working on a project right now to do that to a digital billboard. So I think there are a lot of applications to just say, listen, there are all of these sort of spaces that are built to be invisible, built to obscure the politics underneath our interfaces, digital or otherwise. And how can you create these moments of disconnect for somebody looking at something? I'm not really answering your question.
No,
I didn't really. I'm still trying to get my
mind.
head around it. But loyalty to intent does not exist for me, I guess. It mostly because the intent that I'm whatever. Let's just.
Well, I mean, are you transparent about the process of disruption? I mean, are you in terms of tools that you use or like your practice, I guess? I mean, there's no like, you're not hiding behind the curtain.
Exactly, and that's what a lot of glitch folks attack one another for, right? Is to make glitch art in Photoshop is a little bit counterproductive, right? And so, one of the sort of parallel movements in glitch and dirty new media, the folks that I associate myself with, are using open source platforms, not keeping secret your how do you data mosh or whatever, but to do a video on it and show people how to do it. And so, given more time, I would have taken you through how to use FFmpegX, which is just exactly how it sounds, how to use other programs to remove those iframes. So that's a really important piece, is not hiding that stuff yourself, right? But saying, listen, we can do it, and perhaps we should.
So, Jeff? I think that's what digital humanities in some ways it's why it's become popular. My problem with digital humanities is that sometimes it has been the biggest perpetrator of techno-utopian visions of the future, right? There are a lot of folks doing it, I think, critically and asking some more difficult questions beyond look what we can do with numbers, right? So I think that field has yet to form fully enough for me to get on board with it. That's why I think like a lot of you have found I have work in English and I have fun in art. And when I can bring that stuff from new media art over into English, people are like, hey, that's interesting. We can work with that. Or we can work with our writing students not to just make stuff on things, but to think about the things that they're making stuff on as a part of writing. But I don't know, I'm curious what your answer is to.
I mean, it kind of connects to the push for interdisciplinarity on campus, for example, which is, there's a lot of money for that and a lot of thinking. Well, actually, there's not a lot of money for that. There's a lot of thinking about that, how to make that happen, how to encourage these cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary collaborations. And if you just conflate the disciplinary boundaries, we don't have interdisciplinarity anymore, right? We're just all mushing into a kind of a single way of thinking. And that's not, I think, a good end result of what's going on. So I think having the disciplines makes sense. And then learning how to communicate across those divides, that's difficult, but it's it's such a catalyst for reinvigorating your own work within your discipline. And I think that's the kind of benefit. I think marrying everybody off together, I don't know if that's really would serve everybody, right? And so there might be certain fields crop up, of a time, of a moment, and they are kind of a distillation or a combination of a number of things going on, and then they go back down when they lose interest or the people die off, or, I think that has always happened because new fields come up all the time. But I don't think you want to conflate difference, right? How can you just navigate difference? Respectfully, in an engaged, creative way. That's more of a kind of interest of mine.
I mean, I think it's probably a little bit of my Gemini side, but I tend to view.
Yeah, don't bring up astrology. I'm sorry.
But I mean, there's
scientist objects.
Yeah, there are separate sides to the sort of things that there's this sort of enabling of making functional objects, and then there's the creative side in making aesthetic objects, and obviously one informs the other as well. But you also have to be conscious of what it is that the goal is of the work that you're doing at any given moment there.
It's interesting. There was a okay, gotcha. Okay,
So one of my questions was, Stephen, how do you start to choose what information that you're exploring, and how do you start to make the choices on what program to manage through in order to make those changes, if it's even relevant at all? And then also, you said something about, the purpose was to force us to observe the materiality of this and look at film or video in a different way. What do you expect the viewers to take from that or to do in response to that, even if they're not knowledgeable in the discipline of the digital arts?
Okay, so first part, how do I decide like what to F up, basically? Well, it's usually things that I object to on the basis of technological obscurity, right? What is black boxed? And so Apple computers is a favorite target. A lot of their advertisements and so on, or whatever, right? And because that's my bone to pick, that's typically how I go about it. The programs that I use are, I try to not use anything that's proprietary. I like to use open source because that sort of goes in line with the ethos of this type of art. What was your last? Oh, what do I expect people to do with it? Nothing really. I mean, most people like, I show it to my mother and my father, and they're like, "That looks crappy," or you know what I mean? Like it doesn't. Like what's the point? Or people are like, "Oh, that's so cool." There was this movie Trance that came out a couple years ago, and it was like glitched out the film, the movie poster. I don't know. I mean, when I go to Glitch Fest in Chicago every year, it's like I end up seeing like, "Oh, that's really beautiful," and we tell each other like, "Oh, your work is beautiful." And then sometimes I see something and I hate it, and then I'm like, "Oh, that's what I need to like most here," right? Because it's like it's jarring me in a certain way that goes. That in the same way that glitch art like attempts to disrupt the opacity of media X. A lot of folks, especially in dirty new media, which is kind of an affiliated but much more prone to using difficult subject material, pornography and so on, is to disrupt like the growing aestheticization of glitch. So I don't know, whatever gets too popular and cool and invisible or whatever you want to say, you know, becomes, I think, a viable target, whatever becomes invisible. Which things are always going to be invisible, you know, the one's going to follow the next.
Well, we're at time, and I know Jan is on a schedule. She has to get somewhere. So, but come up and talk to us afterwards. Thank you for coming. And the next month's event will be the Project Showcase event in early May. So if you've got stuff you want to show, let me know. Thanks, everybody, and thank you to our panel. Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.